You're listening to Blueprint of Soul, a podcast about building from the inside out. I'm your host, Sal Carter. Over the past few weeks, we've talked about overfunctioning, presence, recalibration, and what changes when you stop carrying more than was yours. Today, we're taking it one step further. Today, we're talking about what happens when you outgrow the dynamic. Not because someone failed, not because something exploded, but because clarity arrived. And once you can see the structure for what it is, you can't unsee it. Sometimes, growth doesn't break things, it reveals them. Growth doesn't always feel like expansion. Sometimes it feels like friction. Because when you evolve, the roles you were playing don't automatically dissolve. They wait for you to continue performing them. The fixer, the provider, the emotional stabilizer, the one who absorbs impact so others don't have to. And for a while, you may not question it because it feels like responsibility. It feels like loyalty. It feels like love. But eventually, clarity comes in quietly. You start noticing patterns, noticing repetition, noticing that the connection seems to orbit one function. And when you see that clearly, you have a decision to make. Continue participating or stop reinforcing the structure. That decision is where growth stops being theoretical and becomes relational. For me, one of the clearest moments of outgrowth happened in my relationship with my father. There was a stretch of time where I noticed something. I'd hear from him every couple of months, and each time, the calls centered around the same thing: money. Not to check in, not to build connection, not to ask about me or the family, just money. And I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't sending money out of generosity anymore. I was sending it to avoid guilt, to avoid tension, to avoid sitting with the truth. But eventually, I saw the pattern clearly. The relationship wasn't built around presence. It was built around provision. So I had the conversation. I told him I couldn't continue supporting him financially. He didn't argue. He didn't explode. He just simply stopped calling. Right after that conversation, I felt guilt. But underneath that guilt was something steadier. Relief. Relief because the dynamic had been named. Relief because I wasn't abandoning him. I was stepping out of a role that had quietly replaced the relationship. That part we don't always talk about. Outgrowing something can feel clean and heavy at the same time. I'm sharing this because it was a real moment where growth required me to stop reinforcing a dynamic that no longer felt honest. Sometimes, when you outgrow the dynamic doesn't survive. Not because you destroyed it, but because it was sustained by a function you're no longer willing to perform. Not every relationship adjusts when you change. Some expand, some recalibrate, and some stop functioning. When you step out of a role, you create a gap. And that gap reveals what the connection was built on. If it was built on mutual presence, it will adapt. If it was built on shared responsibility, it will reorganize. But if it was built on your overextension, your availability, your function, it may not survive the shift. This is the part people don't prepare you for. We talk about growth like it automatically improves relationships. But sometimes growth clarifies them. And clarity can feel like loss. Not because someone died, not because something exploded, but because the illusion dissolved. You realize you weren't connected through reciprocity. You were connected through utility. That realization doesn't require anger. It doesn't require confrontation. It just requires honesty. And honesty has weight. Because once you see the structure, you have to decide, do I continue participating in something that only works if I keep overextending? When the answer is no, you may feel something unexpected. Silence. Silence where there used to be a connection. Silence where there used to be a request. Silence where there used to be need. And that silence can trigger doubt. Did I overreact? Was I too firm? Did I misread it? But here's the question beneath those questions. Was the relationship sustained by connection or by your compliance? This is where maturity matters. Because it's easy to label this abandonment. It's easy to say, well, if they cared, they would adjust. But sometimes people can adjust to a version of you that no longer performs the role they depended on. That doesn't make them evil. That doesn't make you wrong. It just means the dynamic had conditions, and you stopped meeting them. Growth doesn't always end relationships, but it does remove the scaffolding that was keeping them standing. After the silence settles, after the dynamic shifts, there's a moment most people don't talk about. The temptation to shrink. Not dramatically, not consciously, just subtly. You consider reaching back out. You consider softening your boundary. You consider re-entering the role just a little to see if it restores the old rhythm. Not because you were wrong, but because quiet feels uncomfortable. Growth can feel stabilizing internally and destabilizing relationally. And if you've been the one holding things together, that destabilization can feel like responsibility. You might think, maybe I should have handled it differently. Maybe I could have explained it better. Maybe I'm being too rigid. But here's what matters. There's a difference between compassion and regression. Shrinking yourself to preserve a dynamic is not compassion. It's self-abandonment disguised as harmony. And that's a hard truth, because many of us were taught that keeping the peace is proof of maturity. But peace that requires you to perform isn't peace, it's pressure. Staying grounded in your growth doesn't require you to harden. It doesn't require you to become cold. It requires steadiness. Steadiness is quiet. It doesn't argue. It doesn't justify excessively. It doesn't chase reconciliation at any cost. It simply stays aligned. And alignment can feel lonely before it feels liberating. This is where self-trust deepens. Not when everything improves, but when you hold your ground without turning rigid. Outgrowing a dynamic isn't about proving a point. It's about refusing to keep participating in something that requires you to shrink to sustain it. When you stop shrinking to preserve a dynamic, something subtle happens. Your energy stabilizes. Not because everything resolves, not because the silence disappears, but because you no longer negotiate with yourself. Alignment reduces internal conflict. You don't spend hours replaying conversations. You don't rehearse explanations that no one asked for. You don't overextend just to quiet discomfort. Instead, you begin to experience something steadier. Clarity without aggression. Distance without hostility. Compassion without self-abandonment. You also begin to see your capacity more accurately. When you're not carrying roles that don't belong to you, there is space. Space for relationships built on reciprocity. Space for conversations that aren't transactional. Space for connection that doesn't require performance. Outgrowing a dynamic doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop sustaining something that only works when you are overfunctioning. And that distinction matters, because growth is not rejection, it's reorganization. When you stay aligned, you don't become harder, you become clearer. Clear about what you will participate in, clear about what you won't carry, clear about the difference between support and self-erasure. That clarity may reduce your access to certain rooms, but it increases your access to yourself. And that, more than anything, is what makes quiet strength possible. Before we move forward, I want to pause here, because growth doesn't just happen in theory. It shows up in relationships. This is From the Community. Each week, I sit with a question or reflection a listener shared, not to solve it, but to let it open the conversation wider. This week, someone asked, how do I know if I've outgrown the dynamic? or if I'm just pulling away because it feels uncomfortable. That's an honest question because sometimes growth feels like distance, and sometimes avoidance feels like growth. Here's the difference. Avoidance creates numbness. Outgrowing creates clarity. Avoidance disconnects you from the conversation entirely. Outgrowing keeps you grounded, but no longer performing. If you can stay present in a room without shrinking, without attacking, without rehearsing your defense, that's not avoidance, that's alignment. And alignment may cost you familiarity, but it won't cost you your integrity. Before we close, I want to offer a few practical anchors because clarity without application can feel overwhelming. These are today's blueprint tips. Blueprint tip number 1. Separate the person from the pattern. Outgrowing a dynamic doesn't require you to condemn the person. It requires you to identify the structure. Ask yourself, was the connection built on reciprocity or on a role I was playing? When you name the pattern clearly, you reduce the urge to personalize everything. Blueprint tip number 2. Don't rush to replace the silence. When a dynamic shifts, there may be quiet. Don't immediately fill it. Don't chase reassurance. Don't over-explain your boundary. Don't perform your growth to make others comfortable. Silence can be information. Let it speak before you react. Blueprint tip number 3. Measure alignment, not approval. After you stop participating the same way, you may receive less affirmation, less gratitude, less validation, less contact. That doesn't automatically mean you made the wrong choice. Ask yourself, am I aligned with my values? Am I operating within my capacity? Am I staying present without shrinking? If the answer is yes, approval becomes secondary. Before we close, I want to take a moment to slow things down because everything we talked about today lives in the mind, but lands in the body. This is today's soul segment. When you outgrow a dynamic, the room may feel unfamiliar, not hostile, not dramatic, just different. That unfamiliar feeling can create a quiet urge to become the older version of yourself again. The smoother version, the more available version, the one that kept things predictable. But unfamiliar doesn't mean wrong. Sometimes it simply means you're no longer performing. If certain conversations feel quieter right now, or certain relationships feel less defined, you don't have to rush clarity. Growth is not an emergency. Let yourself sit in the room without shrinking. Let yourself notice who adjusts and who doesn't, without turning it into a verdict. You are allowed to evolve without apologizing for it. If this episode gave you language for something you've been feeling quietly, let that be enough. You don't have to resolve every relationship today. Sometimes the work is simply staying aligned long enough to see what remains. If you want to share a reflection or question, you can always reach us at blueprintandsoulpod@gmail.com or on Instagram at blueprintandsoul. Thank you for trusting this space. Until next time, build with intention and lead with soul.